Hello guys, my name is Matt Mazzola, and I'm going to show you how to get started with the Office Patterns and Practices repository that was recently announced, and also show you a scenario I recently submitted, which is a SharePoint proxy for SPA apps, and SPA stands for single page applications. Alright, so for those of you who don't know, the Office development team recently moved the AMS, which was at Model Samples on Codebox, to GitHub, and it's renamed Patterns and Practices. And first of all, you're going to want to clone the repo to get started. So I usually just copy this URL and then go in Visual Studio. You want to make sure you go into Team Explorer on the right here. You'll click Local Git Repositories, Clone. Going to paste in the URL, and we'll just rename that. Whoops, looks like I already have that folder there. So while that's starting, we'll go back and show you where to get more information about this. So there's this thing called the Office 365 Developer Podcast, and episode 9, as you can see in the description, they do a lot of explaining about the motivations and goals for developer patterns and practices, and you should really listen to this to get a better idea. There's, I think, about 50 examples in there, everything from site provisioning, user custom actions, new JavaScript techniques, and overall general guidance for how to move or how to achieve things that used to require full trust code to use the new app model. So here we are back in here. We had the repository cloned successfully. I originally had it in PnP2, but obviously since I just recloned it in a new folder, we'll go look at that one. So all you have to do is double click it, opens up, and obviously each sample is its own solution to keep things isolated and easy for you to get working. So we'll go ahead and click Show More. The one that I particularly had submitted is in the samples folder right here, and it's called SharePoint Proxy for SPA Apps. So we'll go ahead and open that, open the solution. And of course, the first time you load it, it doesn't have the site URL, so we'll double click that. Actually, we need to go to Solution Explorer, and you'll see down here it says can't connect, so of course let's go fix that. So I'm going to add the URL of my Office 365 developer tenant. Okay, at this point it's going to ask me for credentials. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is I'll launch the app and deploy it, just to give you a quick overview of what the app is, how it works. Or excuse me, what it does, and then later we'll go look at the code and show you how it works. So while that's deploying, you can see in the output window, we're going to go look at another website real quick. So for me, this all kind of started, I had read a blog by Scott Hillier. It's called Managing Tokens in SharePoint 2013 for Single Page Provider Hosted Apps. So I have been doing a lot of recent work with AngularJS and SharePoint apps for a particular client, and this article kind of sparked my interest because it showed a technique to overcome a certain, issue with reusing session state even in Web API controllers as opposed to regular MVC controllers. So that unblocks a pretty significant ability, which is to be able to cache the SP context and then retrieve it. Which allows you to reuse things that have already authenticated. So the problem with single page apps, as you read in Scott's article, is because you're not constantly resending that token from SharePoint, but you still want all your requests to be successful with access tokens, you need to somehow store that on the server, and you can't expose it to the client because then someone could take advantage and possibly misuse your access token. Anyways, our app was deployed or installed, so we're going to trust it and look at it real quick. And so you'll see as you go through the article Scott wrote, it has a nice diagram and shows you all the flow logic of how information gets passed around, why you need to store it in a session, why you can't just put the access token in a cookie because then it's dangerous, people could steal it, etc. So definitely read his article to get a background on what my sample is going to do. And then you'll notice he shows you how to set up sessioning, web API controllers, and then in the very end he shows you a brief example where you have a welcome controller which gets the current user, and then shows you how to make that request from the client. And so I didn't really do much, but I basically took the concept from his article and made it more generic. So you can imagine what happens when you want to make a request for a list or for the title or anything else other than the current user. Well, in this case, you would have to either rewrite this web API controller or add a new action in the controller, etc. And eventually you would have this impedance mismatch where every time you want to change your API or need new information in your SPA app, you have to change your server side web API to match all the data you need from SharePoint. And that's obviously not scalable. And really, when you think about it, the purpose of this is the only requirement for the server is just to add access tokens. So that's what the goal was, is let's make a basic controller which is a proxy, and all it does is add access tokens to the request. So we'll see how that works. So here is the installed app. It's a provider hosted app, and we're just running a standalone version. That's why you don't see any of the SharePoint Chrome or anything. So some of the documentation is actually built into the app, so even if you don't watch this video, you can just install it and run. There's a description of what goes on. There's a link to Scott's article. And basically I tried to, print out some debug information so you can kind of see the internals of what's going on. So obviously all the query parameters that are in the URL up here, like the host URL, client tag, all this stuff, those are extracted and then saved out here in the AngularJS controller. And so here we're going to just submit a request to the app web, right? Normally you would have to use the request, or excuse me, we'll just explain it after I click execute, so we'll see here what happens. So this is the normal request. I think everyone is familiar with the configuration objects you would pass to either the jQuery AJAX function or AngularJS's $HTTP function. They basically take a URL, a method which maps the HTTP method, a collection of headers, data, possible URL parameters, etc. And maybe they have different properties, but more or less they all do the same thing. And we want to keep that same familiar web development mindset and developer logic while being able to write for SharePoint. And so this is why I think this app offers both the best worlds, is because you just let your server worry about the authentication, and you let the people who are used to building SPA frameworks continue doing their job as they normally would. So the trick here is we actually take the configuration object as it was intended. So here's the URL to the app web, and then here's the relative URL to the resource, which is API web title. And I'm calling it transformed request. I guess doesn't really matter what it's called, but more or less I'm just taking the original request and shoving it in the data of the new request, and the new request is actually pointed to our server, and we need to do that so that our server can add the access token. And we'll of course look at the logic in the next one. So this is a quick example just demonstrating that it works. As you can see, here's our response. We did get SharePoint proxy for SPA apps, which is the name of the application, so that's the correct title. Now this time I'm going to actually put some debug breakpoints in and let you guys walk through what's actually happening. So here, remember, this is an AngularJS application, so I have an app.js, which is kind of the most high level, then an index controller where the majority of the logic is. And there is a function called request host web data, which matches what's going to happen when I click this green execute button. So basically I'll put a breakpoint there, and then I'll also go into Solution Explorer and put a breakpoint inside the SharePoint controller. And this is the controller which handles adding the access tokens. Alright, so go ahead and click execute. You can see we've hit our breakpoint down here in the debugger. I would stay in zoom it mode, but my frame rate's dropping, so bear with me for the zooming out here. Alright, so you see we have a service that's built into Angular. We're going to step into that. And so basically what this is doing is taking the request options and excuse me, here was the original request, which was, you can see it's got the URL of the host web, the method, and the basic headers just to accept JSON. It's a normal request, right? And here we're going to take that and apply it to the data, as I said before, and then reuse the proxy endpoint options, which are defined up here, in order to tell the new request to point to the SharePoint server. So we'll step out of that function, and then we have another internal service called send request. As you can imagine, this is pretty straightforward. Don't need to go into that one, but it just takes the transformed objects and then sends it to the server, and then we'll let that go so we can actually hit the controller. So now we're inside SharePoint, and you see we have our request. It's automatically deserialized by the Web API, and now we're going to go get the SP context from the session, and if all goes well, it wasn't null, so we got it. We basically have to convert our request parameter from the body into an actual C# request so that we can actually send it to SharePoint. So I have a little utility method. If we step in this real quick, you can see basically it just takes the parameters on this custom model called request I've written and more or less converts it into an HTTP request message. This would probably be better off as an extension method or something like that, but this is just an example. So here we go. We'll just step out of that. So now we've got a request message, and now we need to get the access token. So we've just got the SP context from the session. So now all we do is you look at the request message, say, okay, is this targeting the app web or the host web? And as you can see in here, it's a pretty simple function. It just looks at the URL and determines which access token to get from the context, and then returns it. And of course, if it can't find one, it throws an error. Alright, so now we have an access token. We apply that access token to the authorization header, and then we submit the request. And this should go back out to the client, and you can see here we've gotten the title of the host web now, which was my developer tenant called Matt Mazzola Office 365. Okay, so that all worked. Now let's go into a little bit, I guess, deeper into the server side. So when you think about how you want to set this up, let me expand some of these folders here. So there's really nothing to it. There's one index page which holds the single page application. I have a few of the utilities folder, which obviously has the function to get access tokens and a function to convert HTTP requests. These can be whatever you want. Here's that model. All it has is a URL, a method, an object to get headers, and serialized data. And the rest is pretty much the same. The only thing I added is a Web API controller, which Scott's article shows you how to set up. And then, yeah, it's fairly simple. We don't actually need this. It's just there from the default scaffolding. So there you go. That's the, I guess, solution that's currently in the repository. And I've actually made some more changes to it. So we're going to go ahead and look at a different version. that I haven't actually merged into the Office PnP repo yet, but I'm going to submit soon. So let's open up a new Visual Studio. Let's see. So this is actually my local version of the app I just showed you. So let's go ahead and close down the other one so we don't get confused. We'll stop debugging. Alright, so here we are. This is the updated solution. So we'll go ahead and deploy this. Alright, again I have to enter my credentials. Also, while this is waiting to install, I guess I want to say one more thing. When you download the Office Dev PnP repository, every single sample comes with either a README file or a Word doc explaining about how to do this. So, for instance, oh, I went into the wrong folder, but see here there's a docx file which goes ahead and explains even in more detail. This won't show up in the GitHub Explorer obviously, but for whatever reason, if I went too fast or didn't understand, you can always go look at the docx and that explains it in a little more detail. Alright, so here we are. We uploaded the, I guess you would call it version 2 of this solution. I do plan on merging it in so everyone can use this code. But I haven't done that yet, and I still wanted to show you while I'm making this video. So not much has changed. I changed the description a little bit to give a little more credit to Scott, because it's really, I would say, his and his team's idea. I just extended it. So the top is the same. Obviously, we can let these breakpoints go by. These two basically do the exact same thing. Nothing's changed there. But I added a new section down here. So for instance, you've seen a GET request to the app web and a GET request to the host web. And I wanted to point out that the reason this is possible is because there's no cross-domain restriction on server-to-server communication. So for any of those who've struggled through using the REST API with the client before, you have to dynamically load the SharePoint JavaScript files and use the request executor, and remember to format URLs properly with, you know, the SpApp context and the variable parameters in the URL. It's not as straightforward as it should be, right? This method actually gets rid of all of that. You don't need the SP JavaScript files. You don't need to worry about using the request executor. And this pattern is the same for all requests. So it actually reduces the complexity for a front-end developer to get up and running with SharePoint apps, which is a very big deal for the ease of development, right? And I didn't write it here, but another thing I want to point out is this technique also applies to any single-page application framework. So right now we're using AngularJS just because it seems to be more popular, and that's kind of what Scott had referenced in his article. But I'm actually a bigger fan of Ember.js, not that it really matters, but of course there's also Knockout and anything like Backbone, a bunch of other ones you might choose or your company might already be investing in. So the next scenario we're going to look at is actually post. So these are normally much more complicated than gets, because you have to possibly get the form digest, you have to construct the body and make sure it matches correctly. So because the technique is the same, I don't have all these pretty debug boxes up here which show you the actual internals and the JSON. So here we just type in a list name, so we'll call it SpProxy Demo 01, and we'll send that. We'll go create a list, and you can see it was successful, and here's the URL to that new list. So if I click here, it actually takes me to the all items page for that list, and I could go ahead and add an item if I wanted to. Alright, so that proves that it also works for post requests, and you'll be able to go dig into the app and see how all of that works. The last scenario that we need to cover for like the full, I guess, requirements you may have as a front-end developer is to submit requests using app-only context. So here I'm going to put that breakpoint back in so you can see what actually changed in the controller. So we're going to request the current user, and if you've done this before, normally it always pops up with your name, but if you do it under app-only context, it will show SharePoint app, and that's because there is no user with the request. So I'll go ahead and click this button. You can see we go into the controller, and now if you remember from last time, all this is new. It would jump right here and immediately try to get the SharePoint context from the session state, and if it couldn't, essentially failed. This time we're actually passing in the SP host URL where we would like to get app-only context, and normally this is where your app was installed on. So here I've installed to my tenant, so I'm passing that URL. If we step in, you can see we're using the token helper to actually go get an app-only access token, and then here that's the access token. So now if we continue on, everything else is normal. Just send a request. You can see it returned SharePoint app instead of Matt Mazzola as the current user. Oh man. Okay, here we are. So that was one thing that was changed, the ability to do app-only access. Technically, you could get an app-only access token from the SP context, but one advantage of doing it this way is that if for some reason you're running this app and you can't use ASP.NET session, app-only access will technically still work, because all you're doing is providing a URL, and it can automatically get the realm from the URL and then get an access token just by making a request. So this is sort of an easy way to get around traditional SharePoint authentication. If you have app-only access, it opens up this little option where you don't have to have that context passed from SharePoint to make your app actually execute. A few more things that changed that are noteworthy. I did run into these problems because I have deployed this technique for a client. You'll notice in the index we have added this line right here, which is XUA compatible tag. We've also changed all the AngularJS attributes to use data dash. And so one thing that I noticed is if you deploy this, in Internet Explorer there's a concept of security zones, and if you go to let me see if I can find the page real quick. Okay, so there used to be a known issue for using app parts in SharePoint due to Internet Explorer security zones, basically saying, hey, we can't share cookies between security zones, and so it's causing people some trouble. And this app actually has a similar problem. So because we're using ASP.NET sessions, the way that works is actually stores a cookie in the request. On the first request, it makes a session ID, and then from then on, that cookie goes back and forth through all the requests. And as long as it recognizes the session ID, it knows that you're still in the current session. So when cookies are blocked, it will continually create new sessions, and it will never be able to retrieve the SP context from the session, which was causing problems in certain use cases of this app. In particular, if it is used in an iframe, such as in app parts. So the easy solution is to make sure wherever this provider hosted app is deployed to, you have to add it to the trusted site zones, or at least make sure that both the site that is hosting the iframe and the site that is hosting provider hosted app are in the same security zone, so they can share cookies. And then the other important thing I mentioned is about this compatible tag. This tells browsers what I guess mode they should run in to be most compliant with the HTML they're rendering. And so one problem we had is because SharePoint is always used in enterprise and you have legacy apps and all these other things to work out, we had a lot of consumers of the app running IE in compatibility mode. And if you don't have this meta tag, I think it defaults down to IE8, and then IE8 doesn't understand attributes such as ng-app, but it will understand if you prefix them with data dash, because that's the actual W3C specification. So those are 3 fixes that you'll need to apply to make sure this is more robust app. So in summary, I showed you how to get started with the Office Patterns and Practices repository, how to clone it and get started and open up those apps. I showed you where to go for more information from the Office 365 Developer Podcast, and showed you Scott's site, or not his site, but the people he's worked with, called IT Unity, where he wrote a great article. And then of course I walked you through the app and demonstrated it so you can get started. I guess my next goal is to actually turn this into a template, so you can go file new SharePoint project and open this, and you'll have a up and running AngularJS application with this proxy all set up and ready to go. But that'll hopefully be in the future. Alright, thanks guys.